I still remember that day as vividly as if it had just happened, the day I first set foot in the village of Monteviero. A small place tucked away in the lush valleys of Umbria, Italy. It was a late autumn afternoon, and the pale sunlight trickled through the silvery clouds, casting soft patches of light over the red-tiled rooftops already draped in moss. I had come to Monteviero on the recommendation of a friend, who once told me about a special legend, the story of the bell of Santa Lucia church that rang by itself. At first, I was skeptical, thinking it might be just a tale made up to lure tourists or a quaint myth kept alive in this remote countryside. But once I stood there, breathing the cold, misty air, I realized there are things you can only believe once you experience them yourself. The old church stood across from me, weary and time-worn, as if it had been locked in a silent struggle against the erosion of centuries. Its stone walls were pale and rough, its heavy wooden doors wore coats of green moss, and above it all towered the bell tower, standing like a solemn guardian over the village. Walking along the path into Monteviero, I passed fields of grapes and ancient olive trees glowing under the last light of the day. The air carried the earthy scent of damp soil mixed with a faint trace of wild jasmine. Here and there, a dog barked from behind an old stone wall, and every sound seemed to be swallowed by the vastness of the approaching night. Everything was wrapped in a peace so deep, it felt like time itself had slowed. I lifted my gaze toward the bell tower. There it was, the ancient bell, hanging motionless yet full of mystery. The stairway that once led up to the tower was sealed off with rotting planks. There was simply no way for anyone to climb up and manually ring it. "You're standing before a miracle," an old man said as he approached me, a kind smile wrinkling his weathered face. He wore a pair of thick glasses, a knitted sweater frayed at the elbows, and moved with the slow care of one who had seen many seasons pass. I greeted him warmly and asked in a low voice, "The bell? Does it really ring on its own?" "It does," he nodded, 3 times a day, precisely at the hours of prayer. The story began many years ago, when Father Benedetto was still alive, and there, under the fading light of Monteviero, he told me about Father Benedetto, the priest whose faith had been so profound that he once prayed, "Lord, if ever there comes a day when no hands remain to call the faithful to prayer, let this bell ring by your will, so that no soul shall forget you." As the story unfolded, I learned that the bell had often rung during extraordinary moments, when storms threatened the village, when a child was gravely ill, when accidents befell a neighbor. It was as if an unseen hand continued to guard Monteviero. That evening, I decided I would stay the night in this village. I needed to hear the bell for myself. I found a small rustic inn at the edge of the village, where the narrow window in my room looked out directly toward the church's silhouette against the hills. Through the thin glass, I watched Monteviero quietly folding itself into the mist, its few flickering lanterns like distant fireflies. Before going to bed, I placed a leather-bound notebook and a fountain pen by my bedside. Under the dim yellow light, I wrote my first lines: "A lonely village, an abandoned church, and a bell that rings into the stillness. Perhaps there is something here, waiting to be discovered." I sat for a long time by the window, gazing into the shrouded night. Out there, beyond the hills and olive groves. Monteviero slept under a veil of old secrets. And somewhere in that hush, I felt it, a whisper not of sound, but of something deeper, stirring gently in the soul. Chapter 1. The Old Tales and the First Nights. I still remember that night vividly, when I sat in the cozy warmth of the village inn in Monteviero. The flickering fire cast long shadows on the walls as I joined a group of elderly villagers. Their faces were deeply lined, each wrinkle a silent testament to the years that had passed. The first to speak was old Giuseppe, a tall farmer with rough, calloused hands from decades of tilling the soil. Back in those days, he began, his voice steady and warm. Santa Lucia church was always crowded. Every child in the village was baptized there. Weddings, funerals, celebrations, they all revolved around the ringing of Father Benedetto's bell. Beside him, Rosa, a woman well into her 80s, added in a reverent whisper, "Father Benedetto was truly a saintly man. Every night, he would kneel in the bell tower, praying for our village. In that warm, wine-scented room, they shared with me the most precious memory of all, Father Benedetto's final prayer before his passing. If one day, he had said, 'No one remains to ring the bell. Lord, please let it ring by your own hand, to remind every soul that you are still near.' Listening to them, I began to feel something sacred lingering in Monteviero. The next day, I asked Marco, a young man from the village, to join me in keeping vigil at the church that night. We prepared blankets, thick coats, and a flask of hot tea. The night air was sharp and biting, and a fine mist wrapped the rooftops and fields like a ghostly veil. We settled beneath the massive elder tree in front of the church. Hidden in its shadow, as midnight approached, the cold deepened, cutting through our layers of clothing. Marco clutched my sleeve tightly as the old clock tower struck 12. And then, it happened. The bell rang. Its sound was pure and resonant, spreading like ripples across the sleeping valley. There was no one visible in the bell tower. No movement at all, only the haunting, steady tolling of the bell. Without speaking, Marco and I dropped to our knees on the frozen ground. It was as if something unseen had placed its hand upon our hearts, stirring within us a deep, almost forgotten sense of faith and wonder. When the bell's last echoes faded into the misty night, the silence that followed was even deeper, more profound. We remained there, unmoving, as the night thickened and the first pale light of dawn began to brush the distant hills. In that moment, I realized that what lived here was more than a mere legend. It was a living spirit, a faith that had never truly died. Marco, who until then had shown little interest in matters of faith, turned to me with tears glistening in his eyes and said, "I will go to Mass this Sunday. We must keep Father Benedetto's promise." I smiled, a powerful emotion welling up in my chest. Right then and there, I knew that I would stay longer in Monteviero, to listen, to understand, and one day, to share this miraculous story with those who might have forgotten. Chapter 2. The Invisible Calling. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the mist, Monteviero appeared hazy and quiet, like a scene from an old painting. Marco and I were still overwhelmed by what we had witnessed. The feeling from the night before lingered deeply in our hearts. We returned to the little inn, still filled with the familiar scent of coffee and butter. Maria, the innkeeper, looked at us warmly and said, "You heard the bell, didn't you?" Marco simply nodded, unable to hide the emotion on his face. I added, "We want to learn more about Father Benedetto and the church." Maria placed 2 steaming cups of coffee on the table and said gently, "If you really want to know, you should visit old Lorenzo. He was the last one blessed by Father Benedetto before he passed away." That afternoon, we made our way to a small house at the edge of the village, where Lorenzo lived surrounded by simple pots and plants. He welcomed us with a hearty smile, even though his eyes had grown clouded with age. In a quiet, thoughtful voice, Lorenzo shared his memories about the days when Santa Lucia Church was filled with laughter, and about Father Benedetto's quiet footsteps echoing beneath the tall arches. His eyes, Lorenzo said, were always looking deep into your soul. He loved every person in this village with a pure heart, without ever judging anyone. Marco and I listened intently, feeling that invisible calling growing stronger inside us. It was no longer just curiosity, it was a gentle, persistent invitation, urging forgotten souls to come home. After a long conversation, Lorenzo pressed an old, rusty key into our hands. "This is the key to the side door of the church," he said softly. "If you truly wish to understand, go there at dawn tomorrow." Marco glanced at me, eyes filled with both excitement and hesitation. I gripped the key tightly, understanding the significance of what we were about to do. That night, we didn't sleep. We sat together by the dim glow of an oil lamp, whispering old stories, waiting in quiet anticipation. Before the first light of dawn, we bundled up in thick coats, carried an old storm lantern, and made our way toward the church. The village was still deep in sleep, wrapped in darkness and cold mist. The old key turned in the lock with a dry click. The heavy door creaked open, revealing a darkness so thick it seemed to breathe. We stepped inside. The air was musty. A fine layer of dust covered everything: the pews, the stone floor, the silent altar. The small light from our lantern carved a narrow path through the darkness. We knelt in silence. Without planning to, Marco squeezed my hand gently. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down around us. And then, somewhere above us, a faint sound stirred. At first, it was barely there, a whisper, like the wind through an old window. But slowly, it grew clearer. The sound of a bell. The bell didn't ring loudly. It resonated softly, warmly, as if brushing gently against the soul. There was no one in the tower, no hands pulling any ropes, only the sound of the bell, rising from the unseen. I closed my eyes and listened. In that moment, I felt a presence, not something frightening, but something tender, a voice reminding us, "I am still here." When the last note of the bell faded into the mist, we remained kneeling, letting our hearts soak in the miracle. The dawn slowly broke. Beams of soft light passed through the dusty stained glass windows, painting shimmering patterns across the stone floor. We stood up, exchanging no words, only a glance, full of new resolve. I knew, from that moment on, our journey in Monteviero had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Special Prayers. In the days that followed the night of the first mysterious bell, Monteviero became increasingly familiar to us. Every morning, Marco and I strolled through the narrow alleys, greeting the kind faces we passed, and listened to old stories retold under the shade of ancient trees. Something special began to happen whenever the bell rang. The village seemed to come alive. In the cafes, people set down their cups and paused. In the fields, old farmers lifted their heads from sowing. On balconies, elderly women slowly thumbed their rosaries, whispering prayers. Marco and I felt it clearly. Every toll of the bell was a silent call, an invitation for long-forgotten souls to kneel once more. On the first Sunday after that unforgettable night, Marco and I joined the villagers at Santa Lucia church. Though there was no official priest, we gathered to pray, to sing hymns, and to light candles that flickered warmly inside the quiet church. The once abandoned church seemed to awaken. Each small flame brought a little more hope. Each humble song touched the depths of our hearts. One afternoon, as the bell rang unexpectedly, we saw old Teresa, the eldest woman in the village, slowly making her way into the church. She leaned heavily on her cane, trembling as she knelt before the statue of Our Lady. She had not returned to the church since the death of her husband nearly 20 years ago. As I gently approached her, she whispered, "I heard him calling." News of these special moments spread quickly. One rainy evening, when the bell rang amid a heavy storm, the villagers instinctively gathered at the church. No one had called them, they simply came. Soaked by the rain, they knelt together under the great arches, praying for a family involved in a terrible accident. The young boy from that accident, little Luca, miraculously survived, defying all medical expectations. His grandmother wept, saying, "It was the bell that reached heaven." As time passed, we began to keep records of the bell's unusual tolling. Each time, it coincided with a need, an elderly man nearing death who needed prayers, a lost youth finding his way back to faith, a young mother praying for her premature baby. Every prayer was written into a thick book kept inside the church. Beside the statue of the Virgin Mary, people prayed not only for themselves, but for their neighbors, for the departed, and for wandering souls. One full moon night, when the bell rang through a misty village, Marco, I and a group of young villagers decided to stay and pray all night. We spread blankets on the cold stone floor, held candles in our hands, and whispered prayers into the shadows. Some swore they saw the faint figure of an old priest walking quietly through the aisles, vanishing into the darkness, but there was no fear. Instead, there was a profound sense of peace. Gradually, Monteviero transformed. Families taught their children to make the sign of the cross before meals. Tiny crucifixes appeared above doorways. Children played in the churchyard, their laughter mixing with the distant echoes of the bell. I remember one early spring morning, when the bell rang through the soft mist. An old man placed his worn beret on the altar and murmured, "Thank you for granting me another spring." And on many days, just hearing the bell gave people the strength to forgive, to begin anew, and to love once more. We understood then that the church, the bell, and the quiet, enduring faith had saved Monteviero, and had saved us, too. I often wondered, Who was ringing the bell? Was it Father Benedetto, or was it the unseen hand of God, fulfilling an unbroken promise? Whoever it was, we knew we had heard, had felt, and had been forever changed. Chapter 4. The Day of Truth. That morning, Monteviero greeted the dawn with a heavy mist and the rich scent of moist earth. Marco and I stood before the porch of Santa Lucia Church, a strange mix of anticipation, nervousness, and an almost tangible calling rising in our hearts. Since the first days we had witnessed the miracles, we had become an inseparable part of Monteviero. Every Sunday morning, the bell would still ring, and kneeling figures would gather beneath the church's tall arches. But today, something felt different. A quiet expectation hung in the air, gentle yet undeniable. The church doors opened, and we saw Lorenzo standing there, holding a small wooden box. His gaze was more solemn than usual. He gestured for us and the villagers to enter. Once everyone had settled into the wooden pews, Lorenzo stood before the altar, his voice raspy but firm. Today, I will tell you a truth I have kept hidden all my life. A truth about Father Benedetto and the miraculous bell of this church. The entire church fell silent. No one even dared to breathe loudly. Even the sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows seemed to soften. Lorenzo opened the wooden box. Inside was an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. This is the journal of Father Benedetto. Every eye turned toward the small book. Lorenzo began to read the faded handwriting. If there comes a day when the faith here fades away, when the songs of prayer no longer echo within Santa Lucia, I offer my final breath, begging the Lord to let this bell ring, to remind the souls of Monteviero to return to Him. Lorenzo paused, lifting his gaze to us. Father Benedetto did not just pray. He offered his very life, making a solemn vow, pleading with God to grant a miracle. In that moment, I felt as if the entire church trembled gently. A soft breeze seemed to pass through, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and tree resin. Lorenzo continued. The night before he passed, he climbed the bell tower and knelt in prayer throughout the freezing night. At dawn, he smiled and said, "Now I am at peace." Then he quietly breathed his last at the foot of the tower. Marco tightened his grip on my hand. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. That silent sacrifice had, over the years, become the invisible thread that bound Monteviero's hearts together. Lorenzo placed the journal carefully on the altar and turned to face the small congregation. The bell is not a random miracle. It is love, it is faith, it is unwavering devotion. One by one, heads bowed, silent tears streamed down faces old and young. After that morning, Monteviero changed deeply. People no longer gathered only on Sunday mornings. Each evening, families lit candles and prayed together. Children were taught their first prayers as soon as they could speak. The elderly found comfort and strength in communal evening prayers. A week later, when the bell rang at dawn, the entire village came together for an outdoor mass. There was no official priest, but there were humble hymns and heartfelt prayers. Under the brightening sky, beside vineyards and olive groves, we sang, Ave Maria, Our voices rose with the bell's peal, soaring far over the green hills. That was the day of truth. The day we understood that miracles are not just dazzling events from heaven, but also the quiet, enduring love between human beings and between us and God. Chapter 5. The Promise Kept. A month after the day of truth, Monteviero had transformed. Families prayed together each evening. Children were taught their first prayers, and small wooden crosses adorned the village's lampposts. Surrounded by flowers, Marco and I, faithful companions in this journey, decided to take on a new mission: restoring Santa Lucia Church. We called for help from the entire village. Carpenters, masons, housewives, everyone contributed, working with their hands, their hearts, and their rekindled faith. The shattered stained glass windows were replaced with new panels, carefully pieced together into sacred images. Cracked stone walls were repaired. Inside, the old wooden pews were sanded, polished, and given a new life with a simple, rustic beauty. Every afternoon, the bell continued to ring softly over the changing landscape. The bell had become the soul of the village, the heartbeat of daily life. But we didn't stop at restoring the church. We started catechism classes for the children. Marco, with his deep love for the young ones, led the teachings. I took charge of storytelling sessions, sharing tales of Father Benedetto's life and the sacred meaning of faith. At first, only a few children came, but soon, laughter and songs filled the churchyard each afternoon. Their innocent voices, singing simple hymns, blended with the bell's echo to create a vibrant, hopeful symphony. One day, we decided to organize a grand celebration to mark the completion of the restoration. It would be called The Promise Kept. For weeks, the entire village worked tirelessly. Mothers sewed embroidered tablecloths for the celebration. Fathers built an outdoor altar, adorning it with white and blue flowers from the nearby fields. The children practiced special hymns to perform during the Mass. Finally, the great day arrived. Monteviero awoke under a bright morning sun. The bell rang early and joyfully. Villagers wore their finest clothes. Little girls dressed in pure white dresses. Little boys buttoned their crisp shirts. Outside the church, a simple handmade banner read, "Grazie. Padre Benedetto, thank you. Father Benedetto." The Mass was held under the open sky. Though there was no official priest, the heartfelt prayers of the congregation rose into the heavens. As hymns filled the air, many eyes glistened with tears. In that sacred moment, something miraculous happened. From the distance, a figure slowly approached. It was Father Matteo, a retired priest from a nearby region who had heard about Monteviero's miracle and felt compelled to come. The village was overcome with emotion as Father Matteo, with a deep, warm voice, celebrated a special Mass and blessed Santa Lucia Church once more. In his sermon, he said, "Faith never dies. It merely waits to be awakened by hearts willing to believe, to sacrifice, and to love." The bell pealed again just as he raised the Holy Eucharist, as if heaven itself was answering. After the Mass, Marco and I stood side by side, looking at the village we had grown to love so deeply. Our eyes met, and no words were needed. We understood. Father Benedetto's ancient promise, that the bell would always ring to remind souls to return to God, had been fulfilled. And somehow, we had become part of that miracle. Chapter 6. The Echo of Prayers. Weeks passed after the great celebration, but the spirit it awakened did not fade. Instead, it deepened, weaving itself into the daily lives of Montevero's people like golden threads through worn fabric. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the bell of Santa Lucia rang out. Its sound was softer now. No longer just a call, it was an embrace. A reminder that faith lived in every breath, every whisper, every silent prayer offered in the twilight. Marco and I often sat on the steps of the church, watching as the villagers slowly gathered. The young and the old, the hopeful and the weary, they came, carrying baskets of bread to share, songs on their lips, prayers tucked carefully into their hearts. It became a ritual, lighting candles, sharing simple meals, and praying together. Under the vast, starry sky, the prayers of Monteviero rose like incense, blending with the mist that clung to the valley. Children ran freely between the pews and the old oak trees, their laughter lightening even the heaviest hearts. Couples renewed their vows before the humble altar. Friends forgave old grievances. Strangers became neighbors. Faith was no longer a ceremony, it was life itself. One evening, as the mist thickened and the bell rang with a haunting beauty, an old woman named Elisabetta stood up with difficulty and began to sing. Her voice, cracked with age, carried across the courtyard, trembling but clear. She sang a hymn none of us had heard before, a song about longing, about hope, about a promise kept across the ages. And somehow, every soul present understood it. No translation was needed. It was the language of faith. Tears shimmered in the eyes of young and old alike. When Elisabetta finished, there was a profound silence, as if the very air bowed in reverence. Marco whispered to me, "This is the echo of all our prayers." That night, as we walked home through the misty streets, I realized that the miracle of Monteviero was not just the bell that rang by itself. It was the hearts it had awakened, the love it had rekindled, the faith it had restored. It was a living miracle, one that would continue to echo long after we were gone. In the songs sung by children, in the prayers whispered at dusk, in the hands joined together in forgiveness, more changes unfolded with time. A small library was built beside the church, filled with donated books, religious texts, old Bibles, stories of saints and miracles. Young and old alike came to read, to learn, to be inspired. Marco led youth groups that spent weekends cleaning the surrounding woods, repairing old trails leading to the church, and planting wildflowers along the paths. Each action, no matter how small, was offered like a prayer. During the harvest season, a new tradition took root, the Festival of Thanks. Villagers would gather fruits, grains, and olives, presenting them at the altar in gratitude. Masses of thanksgiving were celebrated, often followed by long communal feasts where laughter and stories filled the night air. The elderly found new purpose mentoring the youth, passing on forgotten skills. Weaving, winemaking, carpentry. It was as if Monteviero itself had been reborn, not just in spirit, but in every heartbeat of its people. I noticed that even those who had once been skeptical, those who doubted miracles, who felt abandoned by faith, slowly found their way back. It often began with a silent attendance at evening prayer, a hesitant lighting of a candle, and somehow, inevitably, the bell's call would reach them, gently and patiently. One particularly beautiful evening, during a vigil for the sick and the departed, the entire churchyard was illuminated by hundreds of candles. Flickering lights stretched across the grass, reflected in tearful eyes, shimmering like a river of stars. Marco and I stood silently amidst it all, hearts full. "It's not just the bell anymore," he said quietly. "It's them. It's all of us." And he was right. The true miracle was not confined to stone and bronze, but had taken root in human hearts. Stories began to spread beyond Monteviero. Pilgrims came. First a few, then dozens, curious to see the village where the bell rang by itself. But they found more than a story. They found a living testament to hope, to resilience, to the silent power of prayer that echoed in every gesture, every smile. Some stayed, choosing to make their home among us. Artists, writers, musicians came, inspired by the spirit they encountered. Monteviero became a place not just of faith, but of creativity, of new beginnings. One afternoon, a visitor asked me, "What is the greatest miracle you have seen here?" I smiled, looking across the courtyard where children laughed and the bell swayed gently in the breeze. "The greatest miracle?" I said. "It's that we chose to believe. We chose to stay. We chose to love." And as the bell chimed softly once more, carrying across the valley like a whispered blessing, I knew it was true. Faith was not just something we found. It was something we built. Together, day after day, prayer after prayer, echo after echo. Chapter 7. The bell never sleeps. The seasons shifted once more. Autumn draped Monteviero in gold and russet, and the vineyards along the valley blushed with ripe fruit. Though the air turned crisp and the days grew shorter, the spirit that had blossomed in the village only deepened. The bell of Santa Lucia, the heart of Monteviero, continued to ring faithfully. Each chime was no longer a mystery but a part of the rhythm of life, a breathing, pulsing testament to the endurance of faith. As winter approached, preparations began for a special celebration, the centennial remembrance of Father Benedetto's passing. Marco and I, along with the villagers, worked tirelessly. Children rehearsed songs composed especially for the day. Elders wove garlands of evergreen and white flowers, representing purity and eternal life. Bakers filled the air with the scent of sweet breads and warm pastries. Pilgrims arrived days in advance, setting up simple camps outside the village, their laughter and prayers blending into the atmosphere of anticipation. The night before the remembrance, a vigil was held. Hundreds gathered around Santa Lucia Church, each holding a candle that pierced the winter darkness. I stood among them, feeling the solemnity, the beauty, the weight of all that had come before us, and the hope stretching far beyond. At midnight, the bell rang. The sound was unlike anything we had heard before. It was deeper, richer, layered with 1,000 silent prayers and dreams. It rang not just for Monteviero, but for every heart that dared to believe, to endure, to hope. As the bell tolled, I closed my eyes, I saw Father Benedetto, standing at the base of the bell tower, smiling gently. I saw Marco, his face illuminated by candlelight, his eyes reflecting every joy and sorrow we had lived. I saw the villagers, past and present, their spirits intertwined in a tapestry of light. When the final note faded into the starlit sky, no one moved for a long while. Then, slowly, voices rose, a simple hymn, ancient and pure, carried by hundreds of souls as one. Faith had not only survived, it had flourished. When dawn finally broke, the village was aglow. Snow had fallen silently during the night, blanketing Monteviero in a soft, holy white. The bell tower gleamed under the morning sun, a beacon for miles around. I realized then that Santa Lucia's bell would never truly sleep. It had become something greater than sound. It was a living echo of faith. A promise kept through storms and seasons. A guardian of every heart that had ever whispered a prayer into the darkness. Life after the centennial celebration settled into a new, deeper rhythm. The pilgrimages continued, each visitor carrying away a piece of Monteviero's peace in their hearts. Many left letters and offerings at the altar, prayers written on scraps of paper, tucked under candles or into the cracks of the ancient stone walls. Marco and I helped the villagers create a wall of intentions, a place where prayers from all over the world were gathered. Over time, it became a living testament to humanity's hopes, fears, dreams, and gratitude. During the long winter nights, we hosted storytelling evenings by the fire. Elders shared tales of their youth, their struggles, their triumphs of faith. Children listened wide-eyed, learning that miracles are not only grand events but also found in every act of kindness, every choice to believe despite despair. As spring returned, Monteviero blossomed anew. Wildflowers blanketed the hillsides, the vineyards stirred with new life, and the bell, ever faithful, rang at sunrise and sunset, weaving its song into the very fabric of our days. We began restoration work on the old convent next to the church, transforming it into a retreat house. People seeking silence, healing, or simply a reconnection with their faith came to stay for days or weeks at a time. One evening, while watching the sunset from the convent's refurbished garden, Marco turned to me and said, "You know, none of this would have happened if we hadn't listened that first night." I smiled. Sometimes, the smallest whispers carry the greatest truths. Indeed, everything had begun with a single whisper, a whisper carried by the ringing of a bell in the middle of the night, calling two hearts to believe. Now, Monteviero had become a beacon not because of grand miracles but because of everyday faithfulness. 1,000 small acts of love, forgiveness, courage, and hope that echoed louder than any bell. In the late summer, we planted a new olive grove in honor of Father Benedetto. The trees, still young and fragile, bent in the soft winds that carried the sound of the bell across the fields. A plaque stood at the grove's entrance, in memory of a faith that never slept, and a love that never ceased. Years from now, I knew pilgrims would walk among those trees, hearing the whispers of prayers carried by the wind, feeling the living heartbeat of a village that had once nearly been forgotten but had chosen to believe again. Monteviero would endure, not as a relic, but as a living promise. As for me, every time I heard the bell's soft, steady song, I remembered. Faith is not something distant. It is here. It is now. It is in every choice to love, to forgive, to hope, to rebuild. And Santa Lucia's bell, that faithful heart of Monteviero, would never, ever sleep. I am old now. The hands that once climbed the bell tower, that once planted olive trees along the valley, tremble slightly as I write these words. My hair, once dark like the forests of Monteviero, has long turned silver, yet my heart, strangely enough, feels young, younger perhaps than it did all those years ago. On the night when the bell first called to me, today, I sit once more before the church of Santa Lucia. The morning mist clings gently to the stones, softening their edges, as if time itself wishes to be kind. The bell tower rises steadily into the pale sky, its silhouette familiar and beloved. It has been many, many years. Marco has gone ahead of me, as have so many of those brave souls who once restored this sacred place with their hands and their prayers. The children we taught have grown, and now it is their children who run laughing through the churchyard, their voices bright as the sunrise. The olive groves we planted have matured, casting long shadows that sway gently in the breeze. I have come back to say goodbye. And before I leave, I have one last task to complete. This story, our story, must not be lost. It is not just a tale of a bell that rang by itself. It is the story of hearts awakened from slumber, of a village that chose love over forgetting, of faith reborn in ordinary lives. So I write, slowly and carefully, each word a prayer, a gift for those who come after. I write so that when someone, someday, feels their spirit faltering, when the world feels dark and heavy, they might open these pages and remember. Faith does not die, it only slumbers, waiting for a whisper, a chime in the night, to awaken it once more. A whisper like a bell that refused to fall silent. Before I close this book, I leave you, dear reader, with the words that carried me through every season, every sorrow, every joy. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Matthew chapter 26 verse 41. May you listen closely when the bell calls. May you find the courage to answer. And may you always, always believe.